what's the role of South Africa in this? Because it's a key state, right? What do you make of it?
Right. So before I go into South Africa, I'm going to tie up the ends to make you understand. So where do the West African former French colonies come in? So about 3 years ago, we had a Zimbabwean lady by the name of Arikana Chihombori. She was made an ambassador of the AU, and she was then posted in the United States. And while she was in this role as an ambassador of the African Union, she began to speak from the platform of the African Union about the continuation of colonialism pact that France had made the West African former French colonies sign. And she began to explain to young Africans that what France had done is that it takes all the reserves of all its former colonies, 14 of them, puts it into the French Reserve Bank. They manage these funds. And when these African countries want their reserves, they borrow their own reserves. And the interest for borrowing their own reserves that are banked in the French banks are then given to France for its own benefit. So there was a measurement that these French colonies, 14 of them, underdeveloped, they have about 153 billion that they give to France every single year. But they can't develop anything for their own citizens. And contracts, for instance, mining rights, the rights to sell certain things, are all given to French companies. So they have a monopoly on what it is that they can supply their own people. France is the one that has all the contracts, all the military contracts. Then the generals and the soldiers of these armies are trained by France, equipped by France. So this made sure that there was a continuation of French colonialism in these particular countries. In fact, these countries had to pay a tax every single year to ensure that they pay France for the development that it says it brought through colonialism. Now, we all understand that colonialism never brought any development. That is why when the Germans decided to oppress the Jews, they had to pay reparations after just 5 years because they had destroyed people's lives through the form of imperialism, colonialism, and anti-Semitism that took place. It's no different from the colonialism that was in Africa. So these French colonies began to learn from this lady called Arikana Chihombori, who's also a Zimbabwean, that they're under oppression. And she began to stress that they need to free themselves from this oppression. They have to free themselves from utilizing a currency that is printed by France and debt that is created by France. So that is what you're seeing happening now, which goes again to underpin why Zimbabwe is a problem, because it's creating these intellectuals that go into these institutions of Africa, and then they influence this revolution similar to the revolution that took place in Zimbabwe, similar to the revolution that in 1961, Henry Kissinger wrote an entire document called NSSM 39 to discourage anybody from allowing Zimbabwe to win its liberation war, together with the other colonies that were fighting for their liberation in the 1960s, saying that if any single African country successfully defeats its colonizers, it's going to radicalize Africa. So there are examples of Algeria, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, Mozambique, Angola, having successfully defeated their colonizers. And this revolution is being raised once again to the minds of Africans in West Africa, where they're still under colonialism, to say you can rise. And it's a Zimbabwean who was doing that. She had to be fired from the AU at some point. Now, this very same logic that you're hearing me say is the reason why they've always needed South Africa. And it's particularly its apartheid companies to usurp the political authority of the South African government to continue undertaking imperialism and to continue to destroy companies made and rising in these independent African countries, so that white domination, Western domination, and European domination continues. So that's why you see that South African banks are the ones that have grown because of the crime against the humanity called apartheid. They were allowed to keep the unjust proceeds from that, unlike in Germany, where we saw a lot of the German companies that benefited from the Holocaust getting broken up and paying reparations. In South Africa, the apartheid government is still alive because their companies were never dismantled. And the ANC made a mistake of not dismantling these companies. And the mistake was made because some members of the ANC were given shares in these criminal organizations. And these criminal organizations, the biggest of them all, is Anglo-America, which controlled and still controls almost 60% of the South African economy. And it is this Anglo-America, which has shares in the banks, together with the Rupert Empire that has shares in the banks, that then utilize their banks to give loans on the African continent with the same terms and conditions that are given by the IMF and Bretton Woods institutions. Because when you look into the shareholding of the South African banks, you will see that they are majority owned by American institutions like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and what is the other one? There is another one I'm forgetting. Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity. And you also see that there's Norges Bank. You will see Norges Bank there, and you see Dimension Capital. And then these companies have cross-shareholding in all the other shareholders in these banks. So it's an American and a West, I'd like to call it a North Atlantic alliance of collusion and combines that are invested in the South African economy, that see the South African economy being controlled by Western capital. And now the banks, which have American capital in them, institute sanctions illegally, and they also institute financial action task force regulations as if it was law of these countries, blocking accounts, confiscating funds and assets, undertaking non-prosecutorial seizures to try and break rising Black companies on the continent, rising Black billionaires, rising Black millionaires, so that they can continue to have a white monopoly domination of the African continent. So now what we're saying to African leaders is, you are now creating the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But if you allow apartheid era companies of South Africa to have dominance, the banks to have dominance in the financial system, the companies to have dominance in the industrial system, they're going to sabotage the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement in the same way they sabotage SADC in Southern African Development Area to destroy Black-owned companies so that the white-owned companies can flourish. They're also not only destroying Black companies, but also destroying BRICS companies accordingly.